Good evening, everyone. I am Mary McSwain, the Executive Director of the McSwain Trauma Project, and welcome to tonight's Third Thursday Trauma Talk. We thank you for being here and taking time out of your evening to be with us. As you know, usually we have an expert in trauma care that speaks on a given topic, but this month is different. It's our first anniversary for hosting Third Thursday Trauma Talks. And July 28th will be 8 years since Daddy's death. So we decided to go back to our roots and talk about Norman, who he was, what he did, and why it matters. If you will, please mute your phone and use chat features for questions, which will be monitored throughout the talk and then brought up at appropriate times. We're extremely honored to have Dr. Ken Mattox with us tonight, as well as Dr. Ron Gross, who is the Medical Director at Large of MTEP, Steve Mercer, who's the Treasurer, and Will, who is our fabulous Chairman. I want to say in September, Dr. Gross is going to be our Trauma Talk speaker, and he's going to give a more complete history of EMS. Tonight, we're going to focus on a specific time in history with Daddy and his influence and involvement to help develop EMS systems as we know them today. And then a special shout out to Dr. Kramer for a complete and virtual history of EMS. Please visit the National EMS Museum's website. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's nemsm.org. Is that correct, Dr. Kramer?
That is correct. Thank you. Like everybody. Take a peek at it. Thanks.
Excellent. That'd be great.
Good to see you, John.
You too.
So Daddy's career began during the evolution of the modern era of EMS, but to set the stage, let's start at the beginning of his life. He was born in a very small town in northern Alabama, Albertville, Alabama. His sister and brother-in-law and his niece are here with us tonight, as they are every third Thursday. For undergraduate, he attended the University of South in Sewanee, Tennessee. He went on to medical school at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa and graduated in 1963. He did his internship at Bowman Gray, now currently at Wake Forest University. He joined the Air Force for 2 years and finished his surgical residency at Emory in Atlanta and practiced at Grady Memorial Hospital. Graduated in 1970. While he was the chief resident in 1969, he started volunteering for Road Atlanta Raceway and fell in love with trauma. He was the medical director and chief race medical physician and developed the crash and burn course while he was there. During that was in his off time, but by the way, he did have a full-time job and was practicing private medicine and general surgery. One of his partners later went on to be president of AMA. He left Atlanta to pursue an academic career at the University of Kansas School of Medicine, Kansas City, Kansas, where he developed a statewide system. He was there from 1973 to 1977. From there, he went to the Tulane School of Medicine, who hired him to replicate the Kansas system, in Louisiana, which he did. Along the way, he picked up a side job with NASA in 2002 and worked on the mission to Mars. Within 45 years, he co-authored 30 books. He wrote 116 book chapters. He had 419 publications. 139 of them, roughly 25%, were related to pre-hospital. He did 894 presentations. His CV is 111 pages. It's a lot to take in. But let's start towards the beginning. In order to talk about Norman and his lifetime with EMS, you have to overlay the development of EMS during that time. Steve Mercer is here to talk about the 60s and 70s. Steve, tell us about what was going on during that period, the major events that happened.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks everyone for allowing me to be part of this panel tonight. I'm going to put a little timeline up here so you'll have something to look at that's a lot better looking than me as I go through this talk here. But as you'll notice over here, as Mary had described, this is a timeline of Dr. McSwain in there. And I'm going to talk a little bit. Initially, what I want to talk about is I want to spend a few minutes talking about EMS prior to the 1960s to try to paint a picture of where EMS was at in the early 1960s. And following that, I want to address a specific time period, usually about 1960 to about 1981. And talk about some of the major steps in EMS and some of the things that had an influence on Dr. McSwain and his journey through his medical care and his embracement of EMS throughout there. So again, I do want to say that as Mary talked about, and I want to reiterate in here, I'm not going to give a complete history. For that, you would need to hang around for the September and see Dr. Ron Gross and his discussion of the history of EMS. And also, again, plug for the National EMS Museum and Dr. John Kramer, where you can see more and more of this in there. So EMS, or let's not talk about EMS, let's just talk about care of a patient outside of the hospital has a long history. We can go back and find evidence of protocols as early as 1500 BC. Now, again, very, very crude in nature and stuff like that. Roman and the Greeks used chariots to remove injured soldiers from the battlefields. In 1797, Baron Dominique John Laurie, who was the chief physician in Napoleon's army, is credited with establishing the first pre-hospital system, a true system in nature in there that talked about the care and continuation of care into the hospital. Organized field care and transportation and injury actually began in the U.S. after the first year of the Civil War. And if Dr. McSwain was here, he would correct me and remind me that it was the War of Northern Aggression as opposed to the Civil War in there. And all of you that know Dr. McSwain will understand that in there. But military conflicts continues. They provided an evidence for many of the innovations in treatment for transporting injured patients. And it continues to this day. A lot of the things that help us advance care do come from military in there. Civilian ambulance services in the United States began in Cincinnati in 1865. So again, just right at the Civil War time period. And then another one was established in New York City in 1869. Now, these systems or these ambulance services at that time, there were hospital interns rode in horse-drawn carriages designed specifically transporting the sick and the injured. And again, you'll see some of these photographs and everything in September when Dr. Gross does his presentation. And one of the ones I know that Dr. Mattox is with us here this evening, but I wanted to also bring in one of Dr. Mattox's favorite topics at one time was air transportation. The first recorded air medical transport actually occurred in 1915. While the Serbian army was retreating from Albania, they did transport a patient in unmodified French fighter aircraft in 1915. So I'm sure even then that the insurance companies refused to make the payment for that one also. But after World War II, hospitals and physicians began to fade from the pre-hospital care. Again, what happened is most of the ambulance service at that time began to be provided by about 12,000 morticians, mainly because their vehicles could accommodate transport litters. Now, again, understanding here that you had an individual that was going to receive a limited amount of pay for transporting EMS and then, or transporting a patient to the hospital, and another fee if the individual was unable to be resuscitated. So very limited progress in history throughout this time period and limited out of hospital treatment and education. Most everything was based on tradition and some small scientific knowledge. Out of hospital care at that time was limited primarily on rapid transport, plug the holes and do rapid transport to the hospital. So as we enter into the 1960s, this is where we're going to start seeing more and more things that come into play because we're going to get the attention of Congress. So in 1960, President Kennedy announced that traffic accidents in the United States were a major public health problem needing attention. Now, again, 1960, think about this, 1960. So again, traffic accidents, traffic crashes and everything, a public health situation. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced in his health message, trauma was identified as a public health crisis. In 1965, became one of the major turning points in here. Ralph Nader published a book titled Unsafe at Any Speed. While a lot of people think that this book was just a harassment of the Corvair, it was incorrect. What it was is the book's central theme was that car manufacturers were resistant to the introduction of safety features such as seat belts and generally reluctant to spend money on improving safety. And what's also interesting about this is when you talk about a little bit of kinematics is chapter 3 of the book that was published in 1965 actually documented the science focusing on the effects of the human body as it collides with the interior of the car, what we refer to today as the second collision. And as the car hits another object in the first collision. So again, back in 1965, we've got a non-medical individual that's even bringing this into account to talk about some of the injuries due to the lack of safety equipment in the automobiles. Now, this book, though, it had a major impact. This book resulted to help with the creation of the United States Department of Transportation in 1966. Congressional leaders noted the large and rapidly increasing high cost of health in trauma. So, you know, once we get the Congress's attention on how much it's costing, you know that probably something's going to happen to help stem that tide. So this crisis was occurring despite advances in trauma care that had reduced the mortality rate for injured soldiers reaching medical facilities from 4.5% during World War II to less than 2% during the Vietnam War. In 1966, probably the one occurrence that everybody in EMS has a little bit of understanding of is the National Academy of Science released a white paper called Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society. This white paper called for improving pre-hospital trauma care. The paper identified 29 recommendations, of which 11 were related directly to out-of-hospital facility and facility care of EMS. What's amazing about that, those of you that have looked at this, out of their recommendations, a majority of those recommendations still can be applied today in our systems that we have there. But as a result of this publication, Congress passed the Highway Safety Act in 1966.
Like a maraschino
Okay.
cherry. Let's find out. First, let's pour in our Disaronno, which kind of
Somebody is,
had when you were sick as a kid, mixed with poison. Add in
Please
some cranberry.
mute your
please.
Last but
mics,
not
please.
least, my absolute favorite, pineapple juice. Shake.
We're hearing about maraschino cherries. Can someone please mute their microphone?
All right. Thank you. I think you got that taken care of, Will.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Unless everybody was trying to get a drink at that time. So again, this resulted in, it helped establish the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, within the Department of Transportation. Because motor vehicle crash injuries constitute a substantial proportion of the EMS patient load, NHTSA was charged with improving EMS systems by administering grants for ambulances purchased, communication systems, and training programs, and was supporting other traffic-related system improvements. One of the another issue that, or another important feature about this is, again, when we talk about NHTSA supplying grant money and everything, remember that a majority of the EMS systems and everything at this up to this point were volunteer in nature and did not have direct means of funding. So with the Department of Transportation, NHTSA supplying some funding, it was allowing individuals to begin a system that they didn't have or enhancing a system that they had in there. So the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act was also established during this time period, 1966, and it established some of the national standards for training EMTs and minimum equipment required on an ambulance. Some of you have been around a while, remember the mandatory equipment that used to have, that were required to be on an ambulance if you received any federal dollars. So in 1966, this is where people kind of put a pinpoint and say, this is where modern EMS began. In 1967, the AMA hosts a national conference on emergency medical services. So again, now we've got the oversight of the medical community, the American Medical Association, now holding the conference on emergency medical services. And they produced some recommendations on training of ambulance personnel. At the same time in 1967, another article that was being published called Death in a Ditch. It was written by Dr. Farrington, who was a trauma surgeon out of Wisconsin at the time. And it was published in the May and June edition of the Bulletin of the American College of Surgeons. And it presented the concepts that Dr. Farrington used to instruct rescue workers and town people on the safe extrication, emergency care, and transport of patients involved in vehicular crashes. The article outlines the steps that first responders should take in assisting patients' level of injury and providing on-site care for those conditions. The article also demonstrated proper extrication techniques and listed equipment that should be carried in emergency vehicles. In 1968, at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, it launched America's first mobile coronary care unit using physicians that were then later replaced with paramedics. Also in 1968, AT&T designated the number 911 for emergency use. And as Mary indicated, Dr. McSwain was an Alabama boy, as is Mary. But the first call was received at a police station in Haleyville, Alabama, on a bright red phone, which is now on display in the museum in Haleyville. In 1966, the first nationally recognized EMTA curriculum was published, which became known as 81-hour curriculum. Now, again, prior to this, there was no standardized curriculum. People were educated based on local perspectives at that point of time. So there was a multitude of different types of education skill levels of EMS that was being provided in the United States. The American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma and the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons Committee on Injuries in the Division of EMS developed basic definitions and established guidelines for the delivery of emergency care. President Lyndon Johnson's Committee on Highway Traffic Safety recommended the creation of a national certifying agency to establish uniform standards for training and examination of personnel active in the delivery of emergency ambulance services. Also in 1969, as Mary indicated, this is when Dr. McSwain began his long-term relationship with the auto racing while working as a chief resident in surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1970, Rocco Morando, which I'm sure a lot of you will recognize the name, led a multidisciplinary task force made up of EMS stakeholders, a group that ranged from Ambulance Association of America to the National Forestry Services to funeral directors. They met to address the charge given by President Lyndon Johnson and the U.S. Department of Transportation to establish uniform standards for training and examination of personnel delivering emergency ambulance services. Out of this, the National Registry of EMTs was created. Also in 1970, this is the first time California's Wedworth-Townsend Act. It's the first legislation to define paramedics under a state law. And again, this is 1970. In 71, we got to see the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons publish the first EMT textbook, which we all refer to as the Orange Book. If you have a first edition of the Orange Book, you've got a nice collector piece there. The first basic EMTA, which is EMT ambulance, the first National Registry EMTA ambulance exam is administered simultaneously to 1,520 ambulance personnel at 51 sites throughout the U.S. This again marked the beginning of the National Board of Certification for the nation's emergency medical technicians. Also at the same time period, St. Anthony's Hospital in Denver, Colorado, pioneered air ambulance transport by a private service. Now we're going to start talking about a little bit of money. In 1972, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare allocates $16 million to EMS demonstration programs in 5 states. Now, again, think about this, $16 million in 1972. Also during 1972, we see the first residency program to train emergency medicine physicians, and it's established at the University of Cincinnati. And probably the one thing that a lot of us remember from 1972 is the TV show Emergency premiered. Everybody wanted to be Johnny and Roy. The U.S. Department of Transportation determined that because there was no standards for ambulance design, thousands of ambulances, and many of those purchased with federal funds, were not adequately configured to treat patients during transport. So to address this concern, the Department of Transportation requested the GSA, which was the Ground Ambulance Standards and EMS Safety Resource, to develop a standard for ambulances. The National Academy of Sciences Research Council released an analysis of the EMS system showing that the federal government, despite a stated EMS commitment, lacked a coherent policy and had failed to significantly advance EMS. Now, again, that was not a shameful thing. It was saying that there was still a lot of work to be done. In 1973, Congress enacted the EMS Systems Act of 1973 and provided another $170 million to enhance EMS, funding 300 regional EMS systems. It authorized grants to develop a comprehensive EMS system throughout the country for feasibility studies and plannings, for the establishment and initial operations of EMS systems, and for the expansion and improvement of current systems. This act specifically identified 15 components needing to develop, including manpower, training, communication, education, data collection. Those all had to be part of the application process when you were looking for these dollars. Trauma system is identified as an essential with the EMS Systems Act at the same time. And also the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation appropriates and approves $15 million to fund 44 EMS projects in 32 states and Puerto Rico. The DOT creates a Star of Life also in 1973, and North Carolina EMS Act is enacted. At the same time in 73, Dr. Cowley convinced Maryland's governor to issue an executive order establishing the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medicine, which later absorbed EMS and became the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Service Systems. This was the first statewide EMS system in the United States. And again, Dr. Cowley was appointed as its first director. And an interesting comment that he had, this is, and we take to heart, is Dr. Cowley at this time stated that half of the golden hour is in the hands of EMTs. So stop and think about that in there with your trauma care. At the same time, in 73, Kansas state legislation passed a bill requiring the expansion of EMS. And this bill was led and advocated by Dr. McSwain, who at that time was associate professor of surgery at the University of Kansas Medical Center. And in this, they had a hefty goal of trying to establish that 40% of the Kansas population would have access to paramedic level EMS by 1976. A very, very healthy undertaking. In 1974, David Boyd is chosen to lead the first federal EMS lead office in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And Dr. Boyd established a framework and guidelines necessary to implement EMS systems throughout the United States and utilize federal grant funds as an incentive for EMS system development, which resulted in the creation of state and local EMS regions across the country. The American Medical Association issues its first resuscitation guidelines. The Federal Star of Life Ambulance Purchasing Specifications, KKK-A 1822, which we all refer to as the triple K specs, take effect. The National Registry contracts with the University of Kansas to develop and pilot written test and practical examinations for the EMTP. The National Curriculum for Paramedic Training is developed in conjunction with leading EMS agencies in the University of Pittsburgh. A multimedia audiovisual teaching package is produced by the National Registry to train examiners in the administration of an objective practical performance examination for the EMTA. And a new program titled Emergency Medical Training for the State of Kansas was established at the University of Kansas, and it was led by Dr. McSwain. And Dr. McSwain continued to serve as this program's medical director until leaving for Tulane in 1977. At the same time, Dr. McSwain began to travel around Kansas, giving EMS seminars to familiarize local communities with the Kansas University Medical Center's training program. Prior to 1974, as much of the rest of the United States and everything, Kansas was still mostly volunteer-based programs that operated in what we refer to as a scoop and swoop strategy. Kansas City, Kansas Fire Department began operation as an ALS ambulance service with Dr. McSwain as a medical director. And then Dr. McSwain also sent a progress report on the success of the EMT training program to the Kansas state legislators. At this point, he was happy to introduce that 354 individuals had completed the program and passed all required examinations and were approved by the National Registry of EMTs. In 1975, beginning in 1975, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare published its program guidelines, including a glossary of terms. Now, what's interesting is this glossary defined a category of persons trained for advanced life support services to include sophisticated trauma, cardiac care, and other critical care elements for treatment, shock therapy, drug administration, and cardiac rhythm detection control. And this federal document called these people EMT paramedics. So the first time that those two words have been linked together. The Department of Transportation awarded a contract to the University of Pittsburgh for the development of a standard training program to prepare personnel for their roles on the on-scene crisis medicine. The title designated was a national training course for the emergency medical technician paramedic. The American Heart Association created ACLS, and the AMA recognizes paramedic as an allied health occupation. Johnson County MedAct began operating the services, serving all of Johnson County in Kansas, and Dr. McSwain was the medical director. And Dr. McSwain served as the medical director also for the Kansas Highway Patrol emergency medical training. In 1976, as we start getting here, I'm going to move this just a little bit further. In 1976, Dr. McSwain is voted president-elect for ASAP, the American College of Emergency Physicians. And Dr. McSwain served as the pre-hospital medical director for the Republic National Convention that was held in Kansas City, Missouri that year. In 1977, NHTSA produced the first EMT paramedic national standard curriculum. Dr. McSwain served a one-year term as chairman of the Task Force for Accreditation of the Emergency Medical Technician Paramedic Training with the American Medical Association. And at the same time, Dr. McSwain served as vice president for the Kansas chapter of the American College of Emergency Physicians. In 1978, Dr. Jeff Clausen implements the initial system for triaging emergency calls and prioritizing responses in Salt Lake City as part of the DOT's program to improve survivability of vehicle crash victims on the national highways. And he drafted the curriculum guidelines for the emergency medical dispatch. During this time period, he also had a plan to train EMTs to be dispatchers, was developed, but never took off in there. Today, we are seeing a resurgence of EMD training, again, for non-EMTs in with the systems. In 1980, the National Association of State EMS Directors, which later was renamed the National Association of State EMS Officials, is created. And the National Registry publishes its first national standard exam for EMT intermediates. In 1981, now comes another big change. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act consolidated EMS funding into state preventative health and health services block grants. So this change gave states greater discretion in funding. Okay. This change gave states greater discretion in funding EMS systems and activities and led to the dissolution of many of the original regional EMS management entities established by the initial federal funding.
Ask you again, if you haven't muted your microphones, please do. We can hear what you guys are doing. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Will. In closing, I want to just talk about funding again, and I want to go back to Dr. McSwain. In a 4-year time period that Dr. McSwain was in Kansas from 1973 to 1977, Dr. McSwain succeeded in obtaining in excess of $690,000 in funding and grants to develop and continue EMS within the state of Kansas. So hopefully this kind of sets a little bit of tone and starts to begin to identify where Dr. McSwain's love and embracement of EMS kind of came into play, and some of the things that had effects on us within EMS in there. I started in EMS in 1974, and I think Will was in 1974 and 1975. So again, a lot of this has had some effect on us. And also, one other thing I also want to point out is if you look down here in the bottom of your screen at this ATLS, just below the ATLS National Faculty, you get to see one of our next speakers coming up. This is Dr. Ken Mattox down here.
Thank you, Steve, so much. That was a great recap on a lot of EMS history. Dr. Mattox, so as Steve had said, this is a fabulous picture of you. Will you talk about, please, the 70s and the early 80s and the development of trauma centers and ATLS?
You're muted, Dr. Mattox.
Dr. Mattox, you're muted.
First off, I want to thank Mary for putting this together and Dr. Mercer for giving us the 1950s, 60s, and beginning of the 1970s. Before we go any further, I want to remind you that today, this day, and actually it occurred at about 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, NASA put the first man, Armstrong, Neil Armstrong, on the moon. And today is indeed that anniversary of that particular day. In the time that Dr. Mercer was talking, his timeline is level and it looks very organized and smooth. Let me remind you that all of this time during the 60s, 70s, including the time in Vietnam when we had helicopters everywhere, they were called dust off, and they had attendants. It was herky-jerky. The treatment of shock was to give 8, 10 liters of crystalloid in the field. That number was repeated in the emergency room and in the ICU, and we made these huge fluid overload, and the word ARDS literally came out of that hyper-resuscitation. So the bits and pieces that Dr. Mercer shared with you are all over the map. The emergency departments were run by the most junior doctor in the hospital, and they had no training, and the mortality rates were awesome, and the protocols were all over the map. The organizations, let me just name some things that did not exist. EMS did not exist at the beginning. Cardiac surgery, thoracic surgery, vascular surgery did not exist. Surgical critical care did not exist. Trauma care did not exist, and no one had thought of the word acute care surgery. The organization that did exist was the Committee on Trauma of the American College of Surgeons. It was a supper club, a bunch of old farts headed up by Oscar Hampton, I think from St. Louis, and the Committee on Trauma never changed, and they would have big banquets and they would pontificate, but they really didn't do much organizing. And CT scanning did not exist. Aminoglycosides did not exist. Certainly MRIs did not exist. Hybrid operating rooms did not exist. Laparoscopic surgery did not exist. And organizations were forming. In about 1974, 75, there was a meeting at the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. And there were about 12 to 15 people present, some of the early emergency physicians, some of the early EMTs, and some of the early surgeons that could tolerate all of this gibberish were in that room. no one thought to bring any paper. And on the back of napkins, literally the entire field of trauma care organizations, AAST already did exist, but it wasn't very sophisticated. The emergency medicine organized ACEP. And Norm was there, I was there, and almost everybody became an officer either in ACEP in the next 10 years or the University Association for Emergency Medicine, which later became the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine. We organized 2 journals, made the rules for the journals, and began to say we were going to have meetings. I was made the first program committee chairman of ACEP, but at the time, the world's largest concentration of mass raw egos were going into emergency medicine and to surgery, and fights began to occur. Who's going to be going to all these meetings? Who's going to establish the rules? Who's going to own what piece of this organization? And out of that night, these napkins were put together, and order came out of chaos. The director of the American College of Surgeons was a fellow by the name of Rollo Hanlon. He was kind of a personality, much like the first director of the FBI, I can assume may have been. And one day at American College of Surgeons meeting, these young Turks, myself, Don Trunke, Norm McSwain, and mainly docs from the South, a couple of docs from the East Coast, were called into Rollo Hanlon's office. And first thing he did was take over the conversation and say, gentlemen, you all are not members of the Committee on Trauma. You are state chairman. As such, we let you come to the meeting, and you're in the next room, and those things we want you to hear, we'll report to you. What are your intentions with all these things you're talking about? We're talking about designation of trauma centers, verification of trauma centers. David Hoyt was there on size and shape of ambulances. And all of a sudden we looked at each other and said, we're trying to improve quality. And so Rollo said, what you're doing is creating havoc, and you could get kicked out of the American College of Surgeons. And if you ever intend to be on the Committee on Trauma, you better start behaving. Woo! So everybody looked at each other, and most of the people in the room that were surgeons thought their place was in the operating room. And even at that point, residents operated, faculty were never in the house. And as a resident, they got to be pretty good. Some of this even occurred during Vietnam. The regional meetings in Las Vegas and Atlantic City were formed with the surgeons. And so the surgeons said, we'll let the emergency physicians take care of the emergency room, call us down when they're ready, and we'll just do the good work in the operating room. There was great confusion about fluids, vasopressors, how long pre-hospital time. Mass pants were a great area of discussion, and Norm and I were chosen to debate each other at all sorts of state meetings. We got so bored with all of this, at times we would trade each other's carousels and give the other guys lecture to support it. And by the 1990s, there was beginning to be questions about what worked and what didn't work. And that mandated a evidence-based study to be published. That no one knew what evidence-based meant. Evidence-based we defined as being creation of statistics, a p-value, and what values that were statistically different. Norm, as I was chairman of the program committee, it quickly became obvious that that was going to be an organization, this was ASAP and UAIM, of emergency physicians, but no one supplied any papers. But when they supplied papers, it was usually one or two single cases, not randomized, to say, we did such and such. We did an ER thoracotomy. We did cut downs. We were able to use interosseous, not questioning whether or not interosseous or masked or whatever was beneficial. So I chided all the surgical people in these beginning clubs, including Norman, including Lucas and Ledgerwood from Denver, saying, damn it, you said you wanted evidence-based, you wanted these organizations, but you as program directors of a residency are not supplying papers. So Norm the next year supplied a paper, and it was on a device he had created. Maybe someone gave it to him. Maybe he put a few things together, called a needle scope, NEEDLESCOPE. And he presented this at, I believe it was UAIM. And as he presented it, this needle was crammed into the belly. This is long before DPL, long before CT evaluation, long before laparoscopy. Then somehow he had put his eyeball next to this needle scope, which had a few fibers of fiberglass optics, and he was looking for a meniscus sign. And this is still in one of the journals of emergency medicine about 1974, 75. The person who discussed the paper was me. And I reproduced the slides that he had brought. And I demonstrated that he was describing black on black. And at that meeting, we gave awards for the best paper of the year. And we created an award called Imago Obscura. I think I saw on the back wall of Mary's wall when we started the talk, that award that we gave Norm McSwain on Imago Obscura. You couldn't see a damn thing. So he stuck a needle in the belly, he put his eyeball on, and he described nothing on nothing. When you divide by zero, you still get zero. And that was one of the first papers on his curriculum vitae. Hello?
Dr. Mattox, we have I'm doing a time check here. We have one more speaker to get in before.
All right, I will now close. I will summarize Norm's role in the surgical community. He was our representative to the EMS community and to the emergency physicians, and developed that reputation. And most of the surgeons did not want to put in the time and effort that he put in. So who is Norm McSwain in the surgical realm? He is our representative to make this line not herky-jerky, but flat and smooth where we are today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Eloquent and for my rude interruption. Thanks, Dr. Mattox.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, before.
Thank you, Dr. Maddox, and thank you, Will. I appreciate it. Dr. Gross, please help us follow up.
So, excuse me, I will tell you first off, my introduction to EMS, whoever is not muted, could you please mute your
Yes.
microphone?
I think it's
Jen.
Jen.
That'll give us three rooms that we can.
Jen, can you please mute?
Can Christy just mute her?
Yeah, Christy
Oh,
can mute.
That's good.
Oh, this is the crew next door.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just mute everyone that's
We're
not
all the
talking.
time with these meetings for pandemics.
Can you hear Tina?
My first
I
role
got it.
or exposure to EMS was actually
No, Ron, Dr. Gross, you're muted.
Don't
I
mute Dr.
forgot
Gross.
I wasn't supposed to mute. All right. What
Yeah,
I
don't
was
take that
saying,
personally.
and Ken, thank you, Ken and Steve, thank you both for really giving us a good insight into where we had come from and how Norm was a part of it. Just so you all know, I grew up in New York and actually volunteered on our local ambulance for most of my high school career. And I first met Dr. McSwain, not knowing who he was in 1983. I had left Bellevue in 1982. I had moved into a private practice in Connecticut at Norwalk Hospital. And those of you who know the history of PHTLS will know that the first PHTLS practice rounds, if you will, test runs, were given at several hospitals, one of which was Norwalk Hospital in Norwalk, Connecticut. That was in 1983. I had moved to Norwalk in 1982 in college.
All right, we'll see you.
Okay, I can talk over him. I'm known for that. The American College of Surgeons had come out with the Orange Book.
How you doing?
Okay, Ron.
And I had started working with our administration. How does that happen?
I don't
Chris,
know.
I think you muted me.
I don't
Is
know.
that-
You're on there now.
Is that
I
it?
did it. I'm did it. I'm sorry. Go.
There must be some sensors in here, Ron, that,
They're trying to silence me. The college was now looking to verify trauma centers. It was in its fledgling trip down the road with that. And I started talking to my administration saying, we really need to start looking at this. 1983 came and this guy McSwain shows up at Norwalk Hospital with about 8 other guys. And they're teaching, because Norwalk owned their own private ambulance company, they're now teaching PHTLS as a pilot course at Norwalk. And Will, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there were 4 other sites that functioned with pilot courses.
yeah, Joe Deneen and, the stuff you guys were doing out there. And then there was one that ran in Orlando, New Orleans. We had one in Chicago not too long after that, but back then there was only 5 or 6 in the country. You're right.
And I think we were of the first 5.
Yep.
And I briefly met Dr. McSwain. It was, this whole trauma world was new to me. And about 5 years later, after Don Trunke had dinner with me and provided us with our consultation visit, we became the first verified level 2 trauma center in the state of Connecticut. 1990, I became a vice chair of the state COT chapter, started going to meetings. And again, this guy McSwain started showing up. And, I'm sitting in the room with guys like McSwain and Mattox and Trunky and Pruitt, and I'd come home and I'd look at my late wife and I say, I don't understand this. Not only do they know my name, but they're talking to me. And I got to know these fellas, and Dr. McSwain was really an interesting character. He was very charismatic, loved working on the trauma stuff, as we called it back then, loved teaching the residents. And very quickly, I realized that if I wanted somebody to go into trauma, there were, hey, Jen, Jen, are you listening? Thank you. Very quickly, I realized that there were several people in the United States that you needed to know if you wanted to do anything in the world of trauma. Probably those same people that were told by Henlon, if you don't behave, you're going to get kicked out. Trunky was one, Mattox was one, Pruitt was one, Schwab was one, and McSwain was one. Subsequent to that, we started having speakers come to the Connecticut Trauma Conference. And I will tell you this story because it's actually, it typifies the private, not the public side of Dr. McSwain. My daughter was home from college at the time. Our daughter was home, and Joanne and my wife and I were sitting down with Dr. McSwain at dinner. And he gave me a wink, and I went, uh-oh. Stephanie was in college. Joanne had met Dr. McSwain, and Dr. McSwain spent the evening embarrassing my daughter by pretending he was trying to hit on her. It was probably one of the funniest evenings I've ever spent, because his sense of humor is what drew so many people to him. And that was just one of the kind of games that he would play. But the serious part of Norman McSwain was his dedication, the passion to make sure that everything we can do right, we were doing. Everything we were doing wrong, we needed to figure out how not to do. And how do we teach the up and coming generations on how to do everything right and nothing wrong? I remember sitting with him at a couple of East meetings with a couple of my residents. This is a couple, 3 years in a row. Listening to him give advice, listening to him counsel the new generation. And it wasn't a paternal way, it wasn't paternalistic, it wasn't condescending. It was on an even keel, on an even playing field. This master speaking to the junior resident or the junior surgeon who wanted to go into the field. I learned a lot about how to take care of those that we're training. I learned a lot about how to train those people from Norman McSwain. His knowledge was so broad, his passion was so deep, and the way he cared for and treated the people that we needed to care for and treat, both the patients and the ones caring for them, was something that I haven't seen in too many other people, probably 3 or 4, but that was about it. Norman's role in the development of PHTLS, Norman's role in the development of EMS in the United States, Norman's role in making sure that EMS was recognized by the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma was invaluable. And you know, Norman often talked about this guy named Nicholas Sen. Nicholas Sen was a European-born American surgeon who served after the Civil War. I'm sorry, the Wall of Northern Aggression. Nicholas Sen had a wonderful quote. He said, the fate of the wounded rests in the hands of the one who applies the first dressing. Norman McSwain understood that. He understood that golden hour was very much started by the folks who first arrived at the scene. His respect for EMS, his respect for those who tried intubating and sticking IVs in the back of a bumpy ambulance, rushing down the road, was huge. And EMS loved Norman. We all loved Norman. And I will stop on that note because I think there's not much more that you can say about a man other than he was truly loved for who he was, what he did, and how he did it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gross. As it is apropos, Will, please, if you will, take us home. You're muted, Will.
Yep, forgot. Okay, now I am politely unmuted. First of all, thank the speaker, Steve, Dr. Gross, Dr. Mattox. There's not a lot of time left, so I'll just say a couple things to Norman. He used to say, I follow from the front. And you find that out because we'd be walking someplace in a strange country where none of us knew where we were, and he would take off. And about 10 minutes in, he said, okay, where are we at? You know, it's like, y'all got to know I follow from the front. I think he followed from the front, though, because if you were moving too slow, he was going to pass you. I loved working with Norman and Dr. Mattox together. I remember we did some conferences together, and famously in Las Vegas, I think, Dr. Mattox, you guys used to do what was called by some people trocars at 30 paces or something like that. You would even switch topics sometimes and make the other's argument. That kind of discussion was great. I remember, Dr. Mattox, you in particular, when we did one of our first trauma conferences that Norman wanted us to do in Chicago. And I had talked to you about something that you had presented and thought that it was different in certain situations. And you told me, you're probably right. Now go out there and get me the evidence. And I think you were part of this group that Norman was, as you mentioned, was in the lead of. And it just got us to that place where, regardless of our role in the picture of the patient care, we all had the opportunity to make a difference. And guys like Norman and the people here on this call empowered us to do so. So that's how we got to this point. I want to say a few things about the audience tonight. You know, we're strong, but small, but mighty. I want to give special shout out to the folks in Europe, Patricio and Carlos. It's like 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning for you guys. Thanks for joining us. Our friend Cristiani in Brazil, she's also a couple of hours ahead of us. Some of you are probably also from other places, but I'm not getting a good read on where you're from. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. The McSwain Trauma Education Project is, as I said in some videos that we put out and some of our promotions, this is the continuation of the legacy and the mission of Dr. McSwain. We're out there to continue to see what we can do for the good of mankind every day. Go to the website and look at, participate in our activities. We are here the third Thursday of every month. So if it's 8 o'clock and it's the third Thursday of the month, 8 o'clock Central Time, be here. We'll be doing something. Next month, Dr. Allison Smith is going to talk to us about hemorrhagic shock is not the only shock. So that'll be interesting to hear about what she's doing. Dr. Gross in September is going to talk to us, as we mentioned earlier, about the history of EMS. I think we were talking about you were going to do. That's going to be exciting. We have conferences on the road coming up. Omaha, Nebraska, September 29th. Naperville in the Chicago area, October 19th. And Cancun on December 2nd. Lots going on. Just continue to participate. Share your ideas with us. We're not doing this in a vacuum. So if you've got something you want to hear about, tell us. If you got something you're interested in, tell us. If you can participate and support the foundation, we're a charity for $1 or $2 or $100, whatever. All this stuff is funded. When we come to town, we pay our own expenses. So this is the kind of stuff that we're working on supporting. And this is just the beginning. What we do next is only dependent on the support we get from the crowd. So come to the website, have a look at what we're doing. And by all means, tell us when we got it wrong, tell us when we got it right, but tell us something. Anything else, Mary? You're muted.
I know, no, Will, thank you so much. I mean, you said everything perfectly. I mean, we're here for you. We wouldn't be here if you weren't here. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. Monetary support is always nice, but thank you for being here. It makes us feel very special. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Steve. And thank you, Dr. Mattox and Dr. Gross. Thank you for
I
being
have
here.
another thing to say.
Yes,
if you'll
sir.
Give me another minute. I get data from all over the country on various problems. Norm was a member of the National Association of EMS Physicians, a great organization that trained, that did a lot of peer review and worked with the M&M committees of the trauma hospitals. Great, great, great. With COVID, a number of things have happened. Emergency physicians' salaries have gone up. Nurses have traveled all over the country. Pre-hospital emergency physicians that worked with paramedics, EMTs, are dropping out because their salaries are 10 to 15% of the salaries of emergency physicians, so that those who start the mindset of paramedics are decreasing. Those who do the M&M, the checking, the quality reviews are not there. So if there's a complication, we have no one to talk to at the trauma M&M. So I would ask you, your organization, to begin to address this issue of the disappearance of the pre-hospital supervising physician that works with paramedics and EMTs. Thank you for letting me share that problem with you.
Thanks for giving it to us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
See you next month.
You bet.
This is what y'all did for the good of
Well, and
mankind.
take care.
What's that?
This is what y'all did for the good of mankind today. Thanks for coming.
You bet.
Mary, I was
Yes.
staying on to the end. I just wanted to say it's really cool to see you sitting in that office. I love looking at all the stuff behind you. That was really cool to see you sitting there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This
It's
is
great to see you.
Janelle. She's Daddy's niece. She's my first cousin. So thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
And
All
me
right.
and sister. So, yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
It was really cool.
Get the support.
Mary, if I could figure out how to leave, I would.
This is Jane Taylor. This is my mother's best friend. I've known her since I was like 3.
Hi, Jane.
I will. Wonderful, wonderful evening.
Is there an end?
Down in the lower right corner of your screen, you should have a little red button. If you move your cursor down there, that says leave.
Yeah.
There you go. Just click on that.
Ciao.
Thank you for coming, Jane. She's so funny. So thank y'all. I think that went well. We had 42 participants that were here. So I don't know who here still there, but
Yeah, there's not very many. So you guys that have both you and Chrissy both have the ability to mute people that, and we probably should just make that a habit of just, looking to see whose microphone. If you look over on the screen, where you see where the participants are. If you see their microphone without a red, we can go through and do that. And you can also kick people off too. I was about to the point with Jen that she was going to get kicked off.
Jen was kicked off. I kicked her off. Allison said,
okay.
Can we kick her off? And I said, yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
We
So,
know
Yeah,
who that-
because that was very, very disruptive.
it
we know who
was
that was?
very disruptive. We have more people that are here. I'm gonna remove-
Yeah, I mean, my guess is some of those, yeah. Who is Teresa Brown in
wait.
Ireland? Oh,
Hold on, wait just one moment. I'm taking these people out.
yep. There you go. Yeah, those people just basically walked away from the recording.
Yeah.
No.
Well, the one
Okay,
was
all right,
asking for,
so we're good.
the one was asking for credits. She was still there.
And so if they do to info.com, I didn't see that one.
Yeah, I see it now, over here. This
I
guy
was
get
trying
any
to respond.
CMUs for this?
I was just gonna,
I just tell her that, you know, if she can send a request, we can provide her with us,
Yeah,
attendance, verification of attendance.
yeah, I will work that out. Yeah, Teresa Brown. Okay.
will it go to her now? If I send it, it won't.
Probably
Yeah,
not.
she should, her email should be on the registration though with
Okay,
constant contacts. So, and I'll create that, I was gonna do it yet, but I'll create that, the certification, the verification.
You know, actually, what we probably should do, in retrospect, thinking about this, is we probably need to make some introductory slides at the beginning of each T4 that talks about all of the housekeeping stuff and everything, and that, and has all of that in there, so that we, because again, it's so easy to forget one of the salient points and everything in between there. And if we can just do that on all the openings in between there, I think maybe that would be, that might be helpful in
Now,
there.
Christy, if you send me the language that would describe the process, and I'll make it part of the open and close, because I usually do something at the beginning and the end. And I'll put that in.
Yeah.
But you should do the language so I get it right.
Okay.
Thank you, Will. You did a great job.
Oh, thanks.
And Steve, you as well. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Christiani's going to be getting back to you sometime in August. She wants to start meetings for the second annual Brazil meeting.
Christiani?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she'll be.
Christiani and Christy have been besties for the past few months.
Oh, cool. She is an incredible resource.
She is. We're still trying to get our banners and tablecloths from customs in Brazil. So she has been instrumental in making that happen.
Good.
So thank you, gentlemen, for everything. I think it was a good meeting.
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I probably took a little bit longer than necessary, but I couldn't find a lot of that to cut out, you know, because it kind of set the tone for everything.
Absolutely.
And I think everybody did a good job of chiming in there and playing off that. So,
Yep.
All
that
right.
was great.
all right. Well, thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good evening.
Bye. You too.